The dial tone hummed, a flat, electric note that sounded like a question no one knew how to answer. She held the receiver against her ear long after the voice on the other end had vanished, listening to the emptiness of the line. It was a Saturday afternoon, August 4th, and the heat in Brentwood was a physical weight, pressing down on the terracotta roof of the hacienda at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive. The air smelled of dried eucalyptus and the faint chemical bite of chlorine drifting in from the kidney-shaped pool in the backyard. She finally lowered her hand, letting the receiver clatter back into its cradle, the plastic sound echoing too loudly in the hallway that still lacked furniture. She stood there tightening the sash of her terry cloth robe, feeling the familiar drift of dissociation. To the world, she was the platinum goddess, the creature of light who could turn a head tilt into a headline. But here, in the dim cool of the hallway, she was just a woman of 36 whose bones felt heavy, whose skin felt too thin to hold in the chaotic electricity of her own nervous system. The house was supposed to be a sanctuary, the first home she had ever purchased strictly for herself, a declaration of independence from husbands and studios. Yet, as she looked at the unopened boxes stacked against the white stucco walls, they looked less like a new beginning and more like the barricades of a siege. She walked barefoot into the living room. The floor was cool against her soles. Mexican tiles, authentic and rough-hewn, were scattered in the corner, waiting for a workman who hadn't come back since Thursday. The silence of the house was different from the silence of a hotel room. Hotel silence was impersonal. It didn't judge you. The silence of a home you owned was demanding. It asked you who you were when the cameras stopped flashing. It asked you to fill it. And lately she felt she had nothing left to pour into the void but exhaustion, a deep, marrow-level tiredness that sleep could no longer touch. Outside the window, the harsh California light was beginning to soften into the golden haze of late afternoon. She watched a sparrow land on the edge of the unwatered planter box. She had meant to plant herbs there. Mint, maybe, or cilantro, something that smelled like life. But the soil was dry and cracked. It was a metaphor she was too tired to fully articulate, so she simply turned away. Her mind drifted back to the phone call. It hadn't been a tragedy, just business. A reminder of a schedule for Monday. A casual inquiry about her weight. The voice had been polite, terrifyingly polite, masking the steel machinery of the studio system that viewed her not as a person, but as a depreciating asset. They wanted Marilyn. They wanted the laugh, the shimmer, the pneumatic bliss. They didn't want the woman who sat in the dark listening to jazz records, trying to understand why the love she gave to the world never seemed to refuel her own heart. She felt the fracture widening, that terrified gap between the name on the marquee and the frightened child named Norma Jean who still lived in her chest, holding her breath, waiting for permission to exist. She wandered into the bedroom. The curtains were drawn, filtering the light into a bruised purple. On the nightstand, the collection of amber vials stood like a tiny amber city. Nembutal, chloral hydrate. They weren't just medicine, Mom. They were the only things that promised the off switch. She didn't want to die. She rarely thought of death as an event. She thought of it as a rest, a long, dark pause where the noise of expectations would finally stop. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under her slight weight. She reached for a notepad she kept by the lamp. She had intended to write a list of things to do for the house. Buy curtains, fix the pool filter, call the gardener. Instead, she stared at the blank page. The pen hovered. The ink felt heavy. She thought about the script lying on the floor, the pages dog-eared. They wanted her to be funny, to be light, but gravity was pulling at the corners of her mouth. A shadow passed over her face, a fleeting thought that felt like a premonition. It was the realization that she had built a fortress to keep the world out. But in doing so, she had locked herself in with the only person she couldn't escape. She looked at the door. She had recently installed a new lock on the bedroom door, a simple sliding bolt. It was flimsy, really. A strong shoulder could break it, but it gave her the illusion of control. She traced the metal with her eyes. Tonight she would slide it shut. Tonight she would be safe. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long skeletal shadows across the unfinished floor, the house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a stage where the audience had gone home, but the actor had forgotten how to leave the scene. The sun began its descent, bleeding a bruised orange across the Santa Monica Mountains, casting the unfinished rooms of Fifth Helena Drive into a twilight that felt less like the end of a day and more like the closing of a lid. Inside, the air grew heavy, charged with the static of unspoken things. Marilyn sat on the floor of her bedroom. The receiver of the white telephone pressed to her ear again. The cord was coiled around her finger, tight enough to turn the tip white. On the other end was the voice of a man she had known for years, a producer or perhaps an agent, his identity blurring into the singular, monolithic voice of the industry. He was talking about schedules, about the necessity of being fresh for Monday, about the rumors circling the columnists like sharks smelling blood in the water. "We need you to be Marilyn," he said, his tone jovial, but underpinned with the sharp edge of a threat. "None of this gloomy business. The public buys the smile, darling. They pay for the light." She closed her eyes, and for a terrifying second, she couldn't find the voice he wanted. The breathy, rhythmic cadence that she had engineered like a finely tuned engine, the voice that suggested breathless ecstasy and innocent surprise, was stuck in her throat. It felt heavy, like a coat she had worn in the rain and never taken off. She cleared her throat, forcing the muscles to contract, forcing the pitch higher. "I'll be there," she whispered, the sound fracturing slightly. "I'll be good, I promise." She hung up, the click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her hand trembled as she pulled it away. This was the bargain she had made. She had sold Norma Jane to buy Marilyn, but the rent on Marilyn was rising every day, and she was running out of currency. She stood up, her legs unsteady. The house was supposed to be silent, but it wasn't. From the kitchen, she could hear the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Mrs. Murray's heels on the linoleum. Eunice Murray, her housekeeper, her companion, perhaps her warden. The woman had been hired at the suggestion of her psychiatrist, a presence meant to ensure stability. But to Marilyn, in the growing shadows of the evening, Eunice felt like a camera lens that never blinked. Marilyn walked to the bedroom door and cracked it open. Down the hall, she saw the silhouette of the older woman moving with efficient, purposeful energy, wiping down a counter that was already clean. Marilyn pulled back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why was she still here? Why was she always watching? The paranoia, cold and slippery, began to coil in her gut. They were all talking to each other, the doctors, the studio, the housekeepers. They were managing her, discussing her like a volatile stock that needed to be liquidated before the crash. She retreated to her dressing table. The mirror was surrounded by bulbs, but she didn't turn them on. She stared at her reflection in the gray ambient light. The face staring back was beautiful, yes, but it was a terrified beauty. The eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, searching the glass for a savior who wasn't there. She picked up a lipstick, the gold casing cool against her palm. She uncapped it, the red wax smelling of wax and roses, the scent of the studio. She brought it to her lips, intending to draw the famous smile, to paint the armor back on. But her hand shook. A jagged red line smeared across her cheek, a wound in the makeup. She stared at the mistake, her breath hitching. It wasn't just a smudge, it was a crack in the porcelain. "You're falling apart," she whispered to the glass. The voice was Norma Jean's, flat, unpolished, and devastatingly real. "You're slipping, and they can see it." She reached for the pill bottle again, just a half to calm the shaking, just enough to smooth the jagged edges of the evening. She dry swallowed the capsule, feeling it scrape down her throat. The chemistry was familiar now, a dulling of the sharp points of reality, a soft blanket thrown over a cage of wild birds. The phone rang again. The sound made her jump, a physical jolt that traveled from her spine to her fingertips. She stared at the instrument. It was a lifeline to the world, but tonight it felt like an interrogation device. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times. The shrill noise bounced off the tile floors, filling the empty house with an accusation. Answer us, perform for us, be her. She snatched the receiver up, not to answer, but to stop the noise. Hello? Her voice was jagged. Marilyn? It was Peter. Peter Lawford. The connection to the president, to the shimmering, dangerous world of political power that she had flown too close to. His voice was slurred, thick with afternoon cocktails. Just checking in, doll. You sound distant. I'm tired, Peter, she said, leaning against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor again. I'm just so tired of the noise. Don't be a bore, darling, he laughed. But the laugh was hollow. The party's just starting. You're coming, aren't you, eventually? I don't think I can come to the party anymore, she said. And the double meaning hung in the air, vast and terrible. She wasn't talking about a dinner at the beach house. She was talking about the great spinning carousel of fame. She wanted to get off. She hung up without saying goodbye. The disconnect felt final. The sun had fully set now. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the sliver of light creeping under the door from the hallway where Mrs. Murray was still prowling. Marilyn pulled her knees to her chest. The pills were starting to work, but not in the way she wanted. They weren't bringing sleep. They were bringing a heavy underwater clarity. She realized with a sudden suffocating certainty that she was entirely alone. The people who loved her loved a phantom. The people who controlled her controlled an asset. And the woman sitting on the floor, the woman with the smeared lipstick and the trembling hands, was a stranger to everyone, even herself. She looked at the bottle of Nembutal. It wasn't about wanting to die. It was about needing the fear to stop. The pressure in her chest was expanding, a physical balloon inflating against her lungs. She needed to prick it. She needed the silence to be absolute. This was the moment the unraveling ceased to be a metaphor and became a physical event. The mask hadn't just cracked. It had fallen to the floor, and she was too exhausted to bend down and pick it up. The night did not fall gently. It collapsed over Brentwood like a heavy velvet curtain, stifling the heat but trapping the air. Inside the hacienda, the silence had acquired a texture, thick, granular, and watching. Marilyn moved through the hallway, the hem of her robe brushing against the baseboards. She was drifting now, the initial dose of Nembutal creating a soft, fuzzy distance between her mind and her body. She felt as though she were operating a puppet, pulling strings to make her legs move, to make her lungs expand. She was looking for water, or perhaps just a change of scenery, anything to break the monotony of the bedroom's purple gloom. As she passed the kitchen, she froze. The light was on, a stark, clinical, fluorescent buzz that hummed against the quiet. Eunice Murray was there, standing by the washing machine, folding towels with a mechanical precision that was deeply unsettling. The older woman didn't hear Marilyn approach, or pretended not to. Marilyn watched her for a moment. Eunice wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a plant, a root system sent by Dr. Greenson to keep the soil of Marilyn's life stable. But roots could strangle just as easily as they could anchor. Eunice? Marilyn's voice was a whisper, a scratch of sound. Mrs. Murray turned, her face composing itself instantly into a mask of maternal concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dear, you should be resting. The doctor said sleep is the most important thing for tomorrow. I can't sleep, Marilyn said, leaning against the doorframe. She felt like a child confessing a sin. The thoughts, they're too loud. That's just the fatigue talking, Eunice said, her voice smooth, dismissing the reality of Marilyn's pain with the terrifying efficiency of a nurse in a psychiatric ward. Go back to bed. I'll check on you in a little while. I'll check on you. The phrase wasn't a comfort. It was a threat. It meant I am monitoring you. Marilyn nodded, backing away. She saw the truth then. stark and undeniable in the fluorescent glare. She wasn't a patient being healed. She was a project being managed. Greenson, the studio, the lawyers, they were all architects of a renovation project that was failing. They didn't want Norma Jean to be happy. They wanted Marilyn Monroe to be functional. There was a difference, a devastating difference. She retreated to her bedroom, the feeling of entrapment tightening around her throat. She closed the door, and this time, the sound of the latch clicking felt momentous. She was sealing herself in. She went to the bed and sat amidst the tangle of sheets. The phone sat there, a silent accuser. She needed to hear a voice that didn't want something from her. Her hand hovered over the dial. She thought of Joe. He was the only one who had ever fought the monsters for her, sure, even if his fists were sometimes too heavy. But calling him felt like admitting defeat, like admitting she hadn't made it on her own. She thought of the president, a dangerous, glittering memory that now felt like a fever dream. That door was closed, slammed shut by men in dark suits who viewed her as a loose end. She dialed a number she knew by heart. Not a lover, not a studio head, but the private line of Dr. Greenson. She needed to hear the man who promised to reparent her, to tell her that the terrifying hollowness in her chest was curable. The line rang and rang. Finally, a click. "Hello." His voice was impatient, edged with the annoyance of a man interrupted at dinner. I can't find the quiet," she stammered, tears hot and sudden, tracking through the powder on her face. "Ralph, I feel like I'm disappearing." "Marilyn," he sighed, the sound of a man weary of the same circle. "We discussed this. The pills. Take the chloral hydrate if the Nembutal isn't working. You must break the cycle of anxiety. You have to sleep. We have work to do on Monday." "But I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared of the dark." "The dark is just a lack of light, Marilyn. Take the medication. It will pass. I'll see you in the morning." The line went dead. She held the receiver for a long time, the drone of the disconnect signal merging with the buzzing in her ears. He hadn't heard her. He had prescribed a chemical solution to an existential wound. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. There is no rescue. The cavalry wasn't coming. The studio wouldn't save her. They would replace her. The doctors wouldn't heal her. They would sedate her. The lovers wouldn't stay. They would consume her and leave. She looked around the room. It was filled with things, scripts, clothes, awards, but it was empty of life. She was the most famous woman in the world, and she was the loneliest person on earth. The duality she had lived with for decades, the split between the orphan Norma Jean and the icon Marilyn, suddenly collapsed. There was no Marilyn. Marilyn was a ghost made of light and celluloid. And Norma Jean was too tired to keep holding the ghost up. She reached for the nightstand. The brown plastic bottle of Nembutal was nearly full. It looked heavy, substantial. She poured the capsules into her hand. They were small, yellow, innocuous. They looked like candy. They looked like sleep. She didn't want to die. She wanted the noise to stop. She wanted to step out of the spotlight and into the shadow just for a while. She wanted to go to a place where no one was looking at her, where no one was expecting her to smile, where she didn't have to be the golden girl. She picked up the glass of water. It was lukewarm. "Just sleep," she whispered to the empty room. "Just a long, long sleep." She raised the glass. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no swelling orchestra, no thunderclap. It was a quiet, desperate surrender to the need for silence. She swallowed. 1, 2, then another handful. The logic of the overdose hadn't set in yet, only the desperate hunger for oblivion. She set the glass down and it made a wet ring on the wood. She lay back against the pillows, the phone still off the hook, the cord trailing across her chest like a lifeline that had been cut. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the palm fronds against the window, a sound like dry bones clapping. The stage was set for the final act, but the audience was gone. It was just her in the encroaching dark. The room began to swim. It wasn't a violent motion, but a slow, viscous tilting of reality, as if the house itself had been unmoored from the earth and was drifting out into the dark Pacific. Marilyn blinked, trying to clear the sudden fog that had descended over her vision, but the blur was stubborn. The amber vials on the nightstand elongated, stretching into skyscrapers of glass, distorted and towering. The silence she had craved was arriving. But it wasn't the soft, comforting blanket of sleep she had imagined. It was heavy. It was a physical weight pressing against her chest, sitting on her lungs like a wet stone. She tried to sit up, but her center of gravity had dissolved. Her limbs felt miles away, connected to her body by loose, fraying strings. A surge of cold panic pricked at the back of her neck, a primal lizard brain alarm that signaled too much too fast. This wasn't the gentle drift of the usual dose. This was a landslide. The chemistry was rewriting the rules of her biology, shutting down the power grid city by city. She looked at the telephone receiver lying on the pillow next to her cheek. It looked enormous, a white plastic monolith. The dial tone was no longer a hum. It was a roar, a deafening continuous scream that sounded like the collective noise of every camera shutter she had ever faced. She needed to stop it. She needed to call someone. But who? The list of names in her head, agents, lovers, directors, crumbled into dust. They didn't want her. They wanted the construct. If she called the sow slurring and broken, she would just be a problem to be fixed, a scandal to be managed. Norma, she tried to say to remind herself of who was in the room, but the name died on her lips, formless and soundless. Her tongue felt too thick for her mouth. She forced her hand to move. It was an agonizingly slow gesture, her fingers scrabbling across the sheets like crabs on sand. She touched the cold plastic of the phone base, trying to pull it closer, trying to find the hook to hang up the line, to cut off the screaming noise. But her coordination was gone. Her hand knocked the base, and it slid further away, the cord pulling tight across her throat. Not choking her, but resting there, a heavy tether binding her to the machine. The panic flared brighter, searing through the narcotic fog. She realized with a terrifying clarity that froze her blood that she had locked the door. She had built a fortress to keep them out, and now she had sealed herself in with the encroaching dark. She tried to roll over, to push herself off the mattress and crawl toward the hallway, toward the sliver of light where Mrs. Murray was. Eunice. The name floated in her mind. If she could just make a sound. If she could knock over the lamp. She threw her weight to the side, but her body was no longer hers. It was a lead encasing, dead weight. She managed only to turn onto her stomach, her face pressing into the sheets that smelled of expensive laundry detergent and stale perfume. The effort exhausted her. Her heart was fluttering now, a trapped bird battering itself against the rib cage, erratic and terrified. Thump, thump, pause, thump. The room began to darken, the shadows in the corners detaching themselves and creeping toward the bed. They looked like the men in the suits. They looked like the studio executives. They looked like the photographers who had chased her down alleys, hungry for a piece of her soul to sell on newsstands. They were finally here to collect the rest. I tried, she thought, the words echoing in the vast, empty cathedral of her skull. I tried to be her. Suddenly, the fear evaporated, replaced by a profound, crushing sorrow. It wasn't regret for the movies she wouldn't make or the men she wouldn't marry. It was a grief for the little girl who had never really left the cupboard. She saw herself, not as the platinum icon on the billboard, but as the child with the red hair standing in the orphanage window, waiting for a mother who never came. She had spent her entire life running from that window, painting over the glass with smiles and sex appeal, but the paint had peeled away. She was back in the cupboard, it was dark, and she was alone. Her breathing grew shallow, a ragged gasp that shuddered through the quiet room. The air felt thin, insufficient. The biological urge to survive fought one last weak skirmish against the chemical tide. She kicked her leg out, a spasm of resistance that tangled the sheets around her ankles. Her hand grasped the receiver again, clutching it tight, not to make a call, but because it was the only thing in the world she could still hold on to. It was the only hand left to hold. The edges of her vision turned black, a vignette closing in. The roar of the dial tone began to recede, sounding further and further away, like a train disappearing into the night. The sensory world was stripping away. The smell of the chlorine, the purple light, the roughness of the sheets. In the final seconds, the duality merged. The war ended. There was no more Marilyn to perform. There was no more Norma Jean to hide. There was only the silence she had paid for with everything she had. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension in her shoulders, the tension she had carried for 36 years, the tension of holding up the sky for everyone else, finally snapped. Her muscles went slack. The hand clutching the phone relaxed, though the fingers remained curled around it. The room was still. The wind outside continued to rattle the palms, indifferent to the history that had just ended. The light under the door remained a steady, unblinking yellow line. Inside, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic scratching of the needle on a record that had finished playing long ago, spinning endlessly in the groove of the runout, waiting for someone to come and lift the arm, but nobody came. The silence did not last. It was shattered at 3:30 a.m., not by a scream, but by the frantic, metallic rattling of a poker against glass. The fortress had been breached. Outside the bedroom window, Dr. Greenson, summoned by a panicked Eunice Murray, stood in the cool night air, peering through the gap in the curtains. He saw her lying there, motionless, the phone still clutched in her hand, a tableau of stillness that looked terrifyingly like a painting of sleep. But sleep breathes, and the room inside was holding its breath. With a violent crash, the glass broke. The sound was jagged and wrong, a desecration of the sanctuary she had tried so hard to build. Greenson climbed through the window, his shoes crunching on the shards, stepping into the purple gloom of the room. He reached for her, his hand touching the skin that the world had worshipped, the skin that had been lit by 1,000 arc lamps. It was cold. The heat of the day, the heat of the star, had finally dissipated into the neutral temperature of the room. He didn't check for a pulse. The rigidity of her form told the story that no medical degree was needed to interpret. He gently took the receiver from her hand, the connection she had died holding on to, and placed it back on the cradle. The roar of the dial tone cut off. The house was finally, truly quiet. By dawn, the quiet was replaced by a circus. The news traveled through the telephone wires of Los Angeles like an electric shock, waking editors, studio heads, and fixers. The police arrived, their rotating lights sweeping across the stucco walls of the hacienda, turning the private tragedy into a public noir. Flashbulbs began to pop in the driveway, mimicking the lightning storms of the red carpet, but this time there was no smile to meet them. The photographers climbed trees and fences, hungry for one last glimpse, one last frame of the commodity they felt they owned. When the coroners brought the gurney out, the sun was rising, casting the same golden, indifferent light on the stretcher that it had cast on the unwatered planter box the day before. They covered her with a sheet, a pale blue fabric that looked gray in the morning mist. As they wheeled her down the driveway, past the unplanted herbs and the Mexican tiles that would never be set, the most famous woman in the world became instantly and irrevocably a case number. The studio machine, the entity that had tried to schedule her sanity and engineer her soul, stuttered and stalled. Production on Something's Got to Give ceased. Lawyers scrambled to secure assets. The narrative began to be written before the ink on the death certificate was dry. They called it a probable suicide, a clinical term that failed to capture the slow, agonizing erosion of a spirit over decades. They looked for notes. They looked for explanations. They wanted a reason that fit on a headline, a cause and effect that made sense of the waste. But there was no note. There were only the unopened boxes in the hallway. Years turned into decades, and the silence of that night grew into a mythology. The world refused to let her go. They wrote books about conspiracies, about hidden diaries, about political assassinations, desperate to find a villain that could be arrested. It was easier to believe she was murdered by the mafia or the government than to accept the simpler, more devastating truth that she died of a broken heart in a room full of people who loved the idea of her, but couldn't hear the woman screaming for help. We look back at her now, frozen in the amber of 1962, forever 36, forever smiling that breakable smile. We see the photos of her laughing on the beach, head thrown back, and we feel a pang of nostalgia for a time we never knew. But we often forget the cost of that light. We forget that the camera eats what it captures. In the end, she didn't just leave behind a legacy of film, she left a warning. She showed us that you can be the most desired person on earth and still feel completely unseen. She showed us that a house with a locked door is not a fortress if the enemy is already inside. The boxes in the hallway of 5th Helena Drive were eventually unpacked by strangers. Her clothes were auctioned off. Her lipstick cases sold to collectors who wanted to own a piece of the tragedy. The world cannibalized her grief just as it had consumed her joy. But in the quiet moments, when the old films play on late-night television, you can still see it. The flicker behind the eyes, the shadow that passes over the face just before the director yells, "Cut." It is the glimpse of Norma Jean waving goodbye from behind the glass, asking to be forgiven for being human in a world that demanded she be divine. She sought the silence, and finally, beneath the noise of history, beneath the flashbulbs and the theories and the worship, she found it.